All right, hello everyone. Welcome to the final module of the course. We've covered quite a bit of ground this semester, learning about the role of conservation officers in the community and also their role in law enforcement. So this final module will explore, kind of future directions and challenges for conservation law enforcement officers. We've learned kind of how they've changed over time, and now we're going to kind of look to the future and see, where do we think things are heading. And these types of units are always kind of difficult because nobody's got a crystal ball. Like nobody can really see the future. So issues that discussed, this is by no means an exhaustive list of possible things that may happen in the future. There could be a variety of other issues that present themselves in the future. We have no way really of, anticipating at this point. So one of the challenges, that faces conservation law enforcement officers, and this has been a challenge for a long time, is just the citizen lack of knowledge about their role in the community. A recent study, conducted by the National Association of Conservation Law Enforcement Chiefs, or NACLAC, found that like 75% of those that responded to the survey knew very little or really nothing about what conservation officers did or what their role was within their state. So on the face of this, like this may not really seem like a big deal, but this lack of knowledge can lead to, unnecessary confrontations with not only citizens who question, conservation officers' authority to enforce laws, but also with other law enforcement officers that don't really understand what conservation officers do. And this was something that, I dealt with, the entirety of my, career is people really not understanding what conservation officers do. And, in rural areas, it's not as big an issue because in rural areas, there's more people that participate in hunting and fishing and those sorts of things. But then you get into urban areas and there's conservation officers in urban areas, and this lack of understanding about what they actually do can be a pretty big deal. And that kind of leads into the next thing that we're going to talk about. It's kind of the second challenge that's facing conservation law enforcement is changing demographics in America. You have the overall population of America increasing, and as this increases, there's going to be an increase in urbanization. So as urbanization increases, there's going to be less space for outdoor recreation, less space for hunting, less space for fishing. And in that study, urban residents had some of the lowest levels of knowledge, in the previous study. So you have an increase in urban residents coupled with the fact that they have some of the lowest levels of knowledge. So as habitat and area for outdoor recreation decreases, will most likely lead to a decrease in the number of people that are participating in these kind of type of outdoor pursuits. Populations of urban, elderly, minority, and immigrant communities are increasing. Those groups traditionally have not participated in hunting and fishing and outdoor recreation at the same levels as younger, white males. So these changes in the population may have then impacts on natural resources agencies and what their missions are. And if those things change, then obviously the mission of conservation law enforcement officers may also change, with it. So in addition to these demographic changes, also attitudes toward outdoor recreation are also changing. So there was this slight uptick in hunting and fishing during COVID because people were stuck at home. They couldn't go to work. They couldn't do things. So some people who maybe hadn't hunted or fished in a while went back and did some of that during COVID. So there's this kind of small uptick during COVID, but kind of overall the numbers of people that are participating in hunting and fishing has really been declining, pretty much for decades. But this doesn't mean that people aren't enjoying the outdoors, right? It's just a decline in hunting and fishing. So the number of people that are participating in what are considered to be non-consumptive outdoor pursuits, things like wildlife watching, that has increased from 2011 to 2016. And the NACLAC survey identified that hiking, wildlife viewing and photography, camping, those were all more common activities, that respondents said they participated in than hunting, fishing, and trapping. So you have this shift in the type of outdoor activities in which Americans are participating, and that may have a direct impact on natural resources agencies. Most natural resources agencies are mandated to provide hunting and fishing opportunities, and this shift in activity, could lead to this possible disconnect between who the agencies are supposed to be serving and the agencies themselves. And that could lead to things like loss of legitimacy, decrease in funding, things like that. Because if you have people that are participating in outdoor activities, and they look to the Natural Resources Agency and they see that they're promoting these other activities that they're not participating in, or that a lot of people aren't participating in anymore, that could lead to this real kind of disconnect between what the agencies are doing and the people. All right, so speaking of funding, one of the main ways that natural resources agencies are funded is through the sale of hunting and fishing permits. So as fewer people participate in those activities, that provides less funding, right, for those agencies. So also, a portion of the budgets are comprised of tax revenue from acts like the Pittman-Robertson Act, Sport Fish Restoration Act. And as you all know, those acts place an excise tax on hunting and fishing equipment that is redirected to state agencies, to use for various types of activities, habitat work, those kinds of things. So if people are hunting and fishing less, then there may be less tax revenue directed to those agencies. But that seems like a really kind of simple dynamic, but it's really not quite so clear. So Pittman-Robertson places a tax on firearms and ammunition. Traditionally, most of the people that bought firearms and ammunition were hunters, but that's changing. So even though participation in hunting has declined, you have this larger percentage of firearms and ammunition sales that are being done or purchases made by sports shooters or people that enjoy target shooting or people that want these items for home defense. So surely, there's probably some overlap here between, people that hunt and enjoy sports shooting. And surely some of these people that buy firearms and ammunition for sports shooting, even if they don't hunt, would still be fine with tax money going to conservation programs, even though they may not participate in themselves. Other people may want that tax money to go to something different, still conservation related, but something different. And if that happens, then you have this shift in where the money is going and the people that are paying the money, but it's not going to where they want it. So this could lead to some more disconnect between those that are actually providing this funding and the disconnect with what the agency is actually doing. Other forms of funding also have implications for natural resources agencies. Some states receive tax money from the state's general revenue. And in those cases, they have to, at least some degree, satisfy politicians with what they're spending their money on. And if demographics shift, what they're expected to spend those general revenue funds on may also shift, right? Because the people may put pressure on their legislators, who then put pressure on the agencies and how they spend their money. Kind of similarly, some agencies, such as the Missouri Department of Conservation, do not actually receive any general revenue funds in an effort to keep them from becoming too political. But they do have a 1/8 of 1% sales tax that is placed on every item purchased in Missouri. So everything that's purchased in Missouri has a 1/8 of 1% sales tax that goes to conservation. Because everyone in the state pays the tax, you have various groups, you have other things, other people that are trying to influence how those dollars are spent. If attitude shifts continue, it can really affect programs and activities in which the agency participates. And all of this then impacts what the employees do, which could impact, conservation officers. So the loss of revenue doesn't only, directly affect conservation law enforcement officers, because as you know, they're just one part of this larger natural resources agency. But they would certainly face cuts, along with everyone else if revenues declined or if programming changed. You'd have things like your traditional kind of things like reductions in manpower, older equipment that cannot be replaced, those types, typical budget problem cuts that are made. But agencies are then going to have to develop strategies for combating the lost revenues. Okay, agencies may have to approach groups, outside who they traditionally have, outside the traditional hunters and anglers, to help support the agency. For example, the non-consumptive users, the hikers, the campers, the wildlife watchers. It's possible there could be some kind of permit system enacted for those types of non-consumptive users. There could be some type of permit system for maybe using public grounds. It's hard, it's difficult to say. These are just projections, right? But if that's done, then there would likely be some kind of concessions that would have to be made to those groups, right? They would have to do something for those groups. So, for example, if there's some kind of permit for camping, then they would have to have better camping areas and more better camping facilities. If you enact some kind of permit system on wildlife watchers, maybe you would have to have more blinds and things like that set up for people to watch wildlife. Hikers, maybe more trails. Okay, kind of regardless of which constituency is approached for funding, it may require those types of changes within the agency. And then you can also probably expect some conflict then among users. There's already conflict among users. You go to a state-owned property, there's people there doing all kinds of different things, and there's already conflict among users. But this could possibly just increase with funding problems. So as these organizational changes happen, you're obviously going to probably have a shift in the role of conservation officers. So kind of the first obvious one would be an increased focus on enforcing permitting regulations. Conservation officers already do this as part of their job, but if revenues are declining, it may be placed at a premium, right? Make sure you get out there and check for permits, to make sure people are buying their permits because that's a source of revenue. There also may be a shift to something like more educational programming or more public relations work. One possibility could be for agencies to do something similar to what the National Park Service does and have two different types of officers. You have law enforcement officers, and then you have interpretive officers. So you have some that do nothing but education and some that do nothing but enforcement. Another possibility may be for the law enforcement officers to be completely removed from the Natural Resources Agency and placed in something like a Department of Public Safety, similar to what they have in Oregon or Alaska. I think this is probably the least likely outcome because conservation officers are and always have been kind of the face of these natural resources agencies. And I believe those agencies would continue to think that would be important. All right, another important challenge facing conservation agencies is recruitment and retention. And this is a challenge facing all law enforcement agencies, conservation no exception. Conservation agencies, it's interesting because they've been a little bit more immune to this compared to traditional police agencies. But over the last few years, they also have started having some of these same problems. Conservation law enforcement positions were always kind of considered to be really highly competitive positions, way more applicants than what there were actually positions. For example, when I was hired by the Conservation Department in 1999, there were about 700 applications for 22 positions. Now that number has steadily declined over the years. Part of the issue is that people have just gone into other lines of work that pay better. But as numbers of people that participate in hunting and fishing has declined, it's kind of stopped this pipeline that has traditionally supplied applicants for these positions. And while you don't have to have a background in hunting and fishing to be a conservation officer, it's certainly helpful. And people that participate in those things are kind of naturally drawn to conservation-oriented positions, such as being a conservation officer. Another challenge they have is the ability to recruit women and people of color into conservation law enforcement. Now, all law enforcement has struggled with this, but conservation organizations seem to have struggled even more with it when compared to other law enforcement organizations. So kind of in an effort to counteract some of those issues related to recruitment due to the fewer participants in hunting and fishing, state agencies have really increased efforts to recruit people into outdoor recreation, into hunting, into fishing, trying to increase participation across all groups, but have really especially been trying to recruit women and people of color because they already participate at lower levels than white males. Kind of overall, these efforts really haven't been particularly successful. Women and people of color represent approximately 70% of the population. And in a study that I did with Dr. Rossler from Illinois State University, we did a survey of 14 different state conservation agencies, and only 6% of the conservation officers in that study were women, and only 7% identified as people of color. So in proportion to the population, they're vastly underrepresented. And then further complicating that is that when you're trying to get people to join an organization, people are less likely to join an organization or participate in activities when they think they may not fit in, which creates kind of this conundrum. And all law enforcement kind of has this conundrum, is how do you recruit women and people of color when you don't have very many women and people of color already working there, right? So until you get women and people of color working there, you have a hard time recruiting women and people of color into your agency. And there's no easy fix for that. And that's been an issue across law enforcement for quite a long time. As far as retaining officers, kind of the same reasons why they've always had trouble retaining, pay. The increased public hostility toward law enforcement the last few years has really taken a toll on agencies. Officers cite how they're treated by superiors, things like that as reasons why they don't stay. So agencies should really try to find ways to address those types of concerns. Another challenge facing conservation officers and agencies in the future is the continuing wildlife crime, trade, trafficking. As long as there's demand for products, there'll be someone willing to participate, whether that's legal or not. And of kind of particular concern, and COVID really brought this to the forefront, is possible transmission of zoonotic diseases to people through the illegal wildlife trade. There's always been the possibility of transmission of disease from wildlife to people, but when you have markets that are unregulated, operating covertly, right, the potential for those kind of disease transmissions increases. And along that same line, participation in wildlife trade, by transnational criminal syndicates, terror groups, that's of special concern to wildlife law enforcement officers. So if those groups can make money participating in the trade, they're going to keep doing it. And this may increase chances, of conservation officers coming in contact with people, from these groups. May increase the need for conservation officers to participate in homeland security activities. But one big thing to kind of remember from all of this is that the role of conservation officers has evolved over time. As we've learned in class through the history chapter and what officers do, right? This role has always evolved, and the role of traditional law enforcement has evolved. So this discussion of whether or not the role will evolve, well, it's already been doing that for a long, long time. So odds are the role will continue to evolve, and agencies and officers will continue to adapt to it. All right, I'm going to stop here. Please be sure to complete your assignments for this week. And as always, please let me know if you have questions.